Tonight, I want you to drift with me into the soft heat of an ancient Roman evening, where the stone walls still hold the sun's warmth and the shadows begin to stretch lazily across narrow alleys. This isn't the Rome of triumphal arches and grand processions. This is a quieter Rome, a city of backdoor gardens, hushed voices, and rooms where secrets hang heavier than incense smoke. This is a place where what happens behind closed doors matters just as much, if not more, than what's spoken aloud in the forum. Before we start properly, just take a second to press the like button if you enjoy these sleepy little dives into the past. And feel free to leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always find it calming to know this circle of quiet stretches across cities, countries, maybe even continents. Now lower your lights, maybe turn on a soft fan or some white noise. Let your body settle. Tonight we slip slowly into a world where every heartbeat might be heard through stone. It begins on a summer night in the year 64 after the birth of the new god from Judea, though the people here still swear by Jupiter, Venus, and Fortune herself. The Esquiline Hill rests under a dull orange sky, and down one of its less patrolled lanes lies a villa, neither grand nor poor, but private in just the right ways. Ivy coils up its outer wall. A small fountain gurgles in the inner courtyard, and from the caldarium a soft cloud of steam lifts into the air, vanishing just before it touches the stars. Inside, the house breathes its nightly rhythm. A slave boy folds linen slowly, his hands moving with practiced grace. In the kitchen, the embers of the evening fire still flicker, throwing lazy shadows across the tiled floor. Further in, past columns and painted walls, a woman stands by a shuttered window. Her fingers rest on the wood, unmoving. She listens, not to the cicadas in the garden, nor the sound of sandals on stone, but for something else, a particular step, a pattern she's memorized without meaning to. His walk. She shouldn't be waiting. She tells herself that each night. This is dangerous, foolish. What if the master finds out? What if the neighbors talk? But reason is not strong here, not in this house, not in this hour. And certainly not when the moonlight spills through the window just so, catching the silver in her hairpin and the worry behind her breath. Somewhere outside, a door clicks shut, a quiet footfall, then another. Her heart stirs before her body does. It's him. She knows it is. She knows it the way people know when rain is coming, even before the wind rises. She doesn't move, not yet. She just listens. And in that silence, thick and waiting, a story begins to unfold. One that has no place in the laws of Rome, yet blooms all the same behind those high stone walls. He does not knock, he never does. In this part of the city, a knock at the wrong hour is too loud, too bold, too final. Instead, the latch gives a soft click, and the door opens just wide enough for a shadow to pass through. The air shifts slightly, and the faintest scent of iron and olive oil drifts in, his scent familiar and impossible to ignore. He slips through the entry like a breeze through a slit curtain, his sandals silent against the polished tiles, worn smooth from years of quiet pacing. The torch in the hallway burns low, casting its sleepy light over painted walls that watch too many things they were never meant to witness. She still hasn't turned around. She hears him remove his cloak and fold it neatly, as always. She hears the small catch in his breath that comes when he's deciding whether to speak first or wait for her to turn. And so she does, slowly, as if to confirm that yes, he has come again, despite all the reasons he should not. He stands before her now, wearing that same expression he always does in these moments, neither bold nor ashamed, just certain. His tunic is wrinkled, and there's a tiny smear of ash on his forearm, as though he passed too close to a brazier on his way here. His hair, darker than most, is still damp at the edges, as if he had washed just before leaving wherever it is he's supposed to be tonight. A senator's son should not look this tired, nor this alive. They say Rome is a city of law, of order, of glory. But there are no laws in this room, no order either. Just the slow rhythm of their breathing and the space between them that shortens every night, no matter how hard they try to hold it open. She moves first. Her hand finds his, and it is warm, always warm, the kind of warmth that feels like a promise or a warning. He steps closer, and the floor creaks softly beneath them, a small protest from old wood that knows this dance all too well. Neither of them speaks at first. Words would only clutter the silence, muddy it. And this silence is precious. In a city that hums and roars, that gossips and scolds, these quiet moments are the only ones that feel entirely theirs. He leans down, presses his forehead to hers, and she closes her eyes, not in surrender, but in defiance of the world that waits beyond this courtyard. Because once the sun rises, he returns to a home full of statues and servants and expectations carved in marble. And she returns to a life that is perfectly ordinary, terribly respectable, and nothing at all like this. The fountain gurgles in the courtyard just outside the shutters. A breeze moves through the leaves, and the scent of rosemary and worn linen hangs in the air. Somewhere far off, a dog barks, and the city continues without them, unaware or pretending to be. His hand brushes the side of her face, and she thinks for a moment how absurd it is that something so soft could feel like rebellion. But the night is not endless. It never is. And the moment will pass. It always does. For now, though, the world waits. And in the hush of a Roman villa where secrets live like shadows, two people stand quietly in the warm dark, holding on to something that cannot last and yet refuses to let go. Morning comes slowly to the villa, not with trumpets or the clang of the forum, but with the rustling of leaves outside the shuttered windows and the dull sweep of a broom brushing stone in the peristyle. Light creeps gently over the floor mosaics, colouring the tiny tesserae in shades of gold and clay. In the small bedroom where they slept, the linen curtain still sways faintly from where it was drawn back hours earlier. The bed, modest and low, carries the ghost of warmth where two bodies had curled together through the coolness of the night. Now, only she remains. She sits up quietly, fingers to her lips as if holding on to the last words whispered in the dark. He had gone before dawn, careful as always, his sandals tucked into his belt to muffle each step. He had kissed her shoulder once, not to wake her, just to remember what she felt like in silence. She had kept her eyes closed, pretending to sleep, not because she was afraid to see him leave, but because she didn't want to risk making it harder for him to go. She always hated watching him cross the threshold with that particular hesitation in his step. It reminded her that he belonged to another world, one built on duty and expectation, not on late-night visits and half-empty wine cups. The day stretches ahead, plain and predictable. She will dress, pin her hair, nod politely to the cook, and supervise the mending of robes and linens. The household slaves will move about with practiced rhythms, and she will smile and ask the right questions. She will walk to the market perhaps, choose apricots from the vendor with the crooked teeth, and feign interest in the chatter of matrons whose lives revolve around dowries and dinner parties. She will play her part, as she always does. But a part of her will stay in that quiet hour before sunrise, tucked beside him under that worn woolen sheet. In the back of her mind, she thinks of the letter tucked in the small chest beneath her bed. It is folded twice neatly and written in his hand. Nothing romantic, nothing that would raise suspicion. A note about a shipment of oil from Hispania, or perhaps a change in plans for the gathering at the Temple of Concord. Innocent words that carried weight only because of who had written them. She reads it often, not for what it says, but for how he said it. She imagines his lips forming each phrase, the tilt of his brow as he paused to think, the smudge of ink where he leaned too close to the scroll. Every detail is a comfort and a danger. Outside, the city has begun to stir. The baker's boy jogs past with a sack over his shoulder. A neighbor's slave girl calls out for a missing chicken. The butcher sharpens his blade, its steady rhythm echoing faintly across the walls. Rome wakes like it always does, loud and layered and utterly indifferent. No one knows about last night. No one. Suspects. And yet she feels the weight of it with every breath. She rises at last, wrapping her stola around her shoulders and fastening it with care. Her fingers tremble slightly as she smooths the fabric, but she does not pause. She cannot. To hesitate now would invite questions, and questions in this city were more dangerous than silence. The affair hides not only behind walls, but behind glances, behind every careful step and measured smile. And so she walks into the daylight, composed and calm, while beneath the surface, something tender and treacherous quietly beats. The market on the edge of the Subura district was already alive by the time she reached it, though the sun was still low and gentle in the sky. Merchants had begun their morning calls, voices overlapping in a kind of familiar chaos that somehow managed to sort itself into an order only the regulars understood. The air carried the scent of fresh figs, warm bread, and the pungent tang of vinegar from the fishmonger's stall. She kept her head lowered just enough to appear modest, just enough to avoid lingering eyes. In this part of the city, anonymity was its own sort of protection. She moved through the crowd with the ease of someone used to going unnoticed. Her fingers brushed smooth peaches, lifted bunches of grapes, checked for ripeness with the same calm precision as any householder out doing her daily rounds. But her mind was elsewhere, always. Her thoughts drifted between last night and what might follow. It had never been just about passion, though the nights were full of it. There was something more, something that made her stomach tighten in the quietest moments. Not fear exactly, not yet, but a sense that they were both walking closer to a line that once crossed could not be undone. A woman she recognized called to her across the street, waving a hand too large for her delicate rings. She returned the gesture politely, her smile practiced, as though her morning had been spent reading poetry or instructing her servant girls in needlework. No one saw anything different in her. That was the key. There could be no sign, not in her hair neatly pinned, not in her tone, measured and bright, and certainly not in her eyes, which had learned to carry secrets like water in a sealed jar, still and silent, but always shifting just beneath the surface. A slave boy from the villa met her at the edge of the square, carrying a basket and bowing too deeply for her liking. He was young, perhaps 12, with nervous hands and a habit of watching too closely. She didn't speak much to him as they walked back, letting the quiet press between them. She could feel his curiosity, thick as the morning air, but he said nothing. Still, she made a note to ask her steward later if the boy could be moved to kitchen duty or errands further from the house. One cannot afford watchers, even ones too young to understand what they're watching. By the time they returned, the villa was stirring, fully into life. The steward was directing the movement of olive oil jars into the storeroom. A servant was sweeping petals from the atrium pool. Voices echoed from the laundry, punctuated by the thudding rhythm of cloth against stone. She passed them all with her usual nod, ascending the steps back to her chambers where she could breathe more freely. But freedom was fleeting. On her table, folded with perfect care, was a note. Not in his handwriting this time. That would have been foolish. It was simply a list, penned by a servant's hand, detailing wine purchases and an upcoming dinner invitation. But beneath one of the names, a senator's wife who hosted dull evenings of overcooked lamb and tired conversation, there was a mark, a simple cross in faded ink, their code. Her fingers lingered on the parchment, absorbing its quiet urgency. There would be a gathering, he would be there. So would others, too many others. She folded the note, tucked it away, and stood silently in the middle of the room, her breath steady, her heart not. The game was shifting again, and in Rome, when the game shifted, so too did the dangers that came with it. The days before the gathering passed with the quiet urgency of a storm gathering on the horizon. Nothing appeared different from the outside. The routine of the villa continued unbroken. She moved from room to room, supervising the drying of linens, the sharpening of kitchen blades, the placement of fresh garlands on household altars. She answered letters with polite brevity, approved a shipment of honey jars from a farm outside Tibur, and oversaw the scouring of the marble floors. Her household knew her as precise, steady, incapable of delay or indulgence. They admired her for it. They also feared her silences, which were becoming more frequent. Inwardly, she rehearsed. Not her lines, for there would be no performance that could be planned down to the word. But she rehearsed the tilt of her head, the appropriate softness in her voice when addressing certain guests, the exact number of seconds she could hold his gaze before it became noticeable. The evening would be a gathering of Rome's quieter elite. Not the roaring aristocracy with their public feasts and reckless excesses, but the sort of men who wielded influence behind doors and the women who smiled graciously while knowing full well that one misstep in posture or tone could be whispered into scandal by morning. The day of the dinner, the villa took on a strange energy. It was not anxiety exactly, but something knotted and dense beneath the surface. Servants moved faster, adjusting candle heights, restocking amphorae, rearranging seating at her subtle direction. The atrium was dressed with oil lamps and fresh fronds from the garden. The mosaic floor was scrubbed until the tiny tiles glistened, and soft music began to float in from the inner courtyard, just enough to fill the silence between conversations without drawing attention to itself. Iski dressed carefully, not lavishly, for that would have been noticed. A deep plum stola belted loosely, and gold pins set simply in her hair. Her sandals matched the trim of her neckline, a touch of rose oil behind each ear. Enough to be memorable, never enough to be obvious. When she stepped into the room, her guests were already arriving, some announced with too much fanfare, others with the discreet nods of old families, long accustomed to gliding through Roman society without sound. He arrived late, as she knew he would. Not fashionably late, not rudely either. Just timed. His father was not present, of course. That would have made things complicated. But he came with 2 clients and a cousin who spoke too loudly and drank too quickly. His entrance was casual, his eyes passing over the room, like a man scanning for someone who may or may not be there. He found her almost immediately, of course, and looked past her just as quickly, but not before their glances locked, just for a moment, just long enough to tell her that yes, he had seen the mark on the note. And yes, he understood what it meant. Through dinner, she played her role with practiced ease. She asked questions, offered compliments, laughed lightly when the situation called for it. All the while, she was aware of him across the room, speaking with a magistrate's wife about the grain riots. She could hear his voice even when she wasn't listening for it, like the soft hum of something distant, yet unavoidable. Their eyes met only once more, just before the final course was served. A passing glance over a tray of honeyed dates and spiced almonds, the kind of glance no one would think twice about. Unless, of course, they knew, and someone always knew. As the final dishes were cleared and the wine was poured a little more freely, the voices in the room grew both louder and looser, as if the weight of propriety was being gradually lifted by each passing cup. It was then that the real conversations began. Not the earlier exchanges of civic virtue and family fortunes, but the quieter threads that snaked through sips of Falernian and glances over flickering flames. The music in the courtyard continued, soft and distant now, barely more than a suggestion beneath the hum of dialogue. Somewhere in the shadows, a flute player continued her tune with the patience of someone trained to be unnoticed. She stood near the back arch of the dining room, her hand resting on the cool marble of a column, her posture effortlessly elegant. It gave her the appearance of being at ease, yet it positioned her perfectly between the exits and the adjoining garden where conversations often flowed after a meal. From here, she could see the faces of every guest as they moved, laughed, whispered. Her ears caught fragments of gossip: who had been snubbed at the last games, whose daughter was now betrothed to an older merchant with missing teeth, who had been seen speaking too often with a man who was no longer welcome at the Senate. Rome, even at its most relaxed, was always building stories, always assembling rumors like small bricks in a wall that might one day trap someone entirely, and then, with perfect subtlety, he moved toward the garden. Not in a way that suggested intention, just as any guest might, wishing for cooler air and a brief escape from the density of the dining hall. She waited, not long, just long enough to ensure that no one else followed. Then she made her own way through the arch, her steps slow, her expression unchanged. No one would say she looked eager, no one would say she looked troubled. She looked, as always, composed, but inside her heartbeat had begun its familiar climb. The garden was lit by hanging lanterns, their glow softened by the curling leaves of fig and bay trees. A shallow basin of water mirrored the night sky, and the scent of blooming jasmine hung low in the air like a sigh. He stood by the far wall just past the reach of the lanterns, where only a trace of gold touched his shoulder. His arms were crossed, not tightly, just enough to give his body the appearance of thought. When she stepped beside him, he didn't turn at once. They stood that way for several seconds, not speaking, not touching, just existing side by side in the kind of silence that speaks louder than a dozen well-formed phrases. "You weren't followed?" he asked, his voice low and careful. "No," she replied, equally quiet. "I watched. I waited. There were too many people in the atrium. They were distracted." He nodded slightly, though his eyes remained fixed ahead, as if afraid that looking at her too soon might pull them both into something neither could step out of easily. They said nothing more for a time, just breathed the same air, listened to the same distant murmur of laughter behind them, and tried to hold back the truth that pressed at the edges of their shared silence. She finally turned to him just slightly, enough to let the lamplight catch the outline of her cheek. "You should go back in first," she whispered. "They'll miss you sooner." He looked at her, then really looked, and the restraint in his eyes was almost painful. "5 more breaths," he said. "Just 5. And so they stood, not counting aloud, just measuring time with the quiet ache of presence, holding their shared secret close beneath the jasmine's sweet night. The 5 breaths passed slowly, drawn out like silk unraveling from a spool. Each one seemed to stretch time a little thinner, as if the night itself had agreed to pause just long enough for 2 people who should not be standing so close. She didn't move, not even when his hand brushed briefly against hers. It was not a touch meant to linger, it was a confirmation. A quiet way of saying, yes, I feel it too. But then he turned, as promised, and walked back into the villa through the carved stone arch without glancing over his shoulder. The lamplight caught the edge of his tunic as he disappeared inside, leaving her alone among the rustling leaves and the soft sound of water echoing against the garden wall. She stayed where she was for a little while, listening to the hum of conversation rising and falling in waves, to the faint ring of ceramic as cups were lifted and set down, to the light laughter of women who had mastered the art of appearing carefree. It was all so ordinary, and yet she stood there, unmoving, wrapped in the sense that nothing about this evening was ordinary anymore. Not for her, not for him, not for the version of their lives they were beginning to write in fragments and shadows. Eventually she returned to the gathering. She smiled when addressed, laughed in the right moments, offered a compliment to a senator's wife who had always looked down on her slightly for not marrying into higher influence. No one remarked upon her absence, no one suspected what had passed in the garden or what still trembled under the surface of her composure. And yet, as she poured herself a modest portion of watered wine and sat once more beneath the hanging oil lamps, she caught a glimpse of one of the older guests watching her from across the room. A man with a curved spine and a gaze like cooled ash. He said nothing, merely raised his cup in her direction, then turned back to the woman beside him and resumed his quiet conversation. But something in the way he watched her chilled her more than the night air ever could. When the final guests departed, and the last slave extinguished the atrium lamps, she lingered alone in the dining hall. The house had grown quiet again, returned to its rhythm of muted footfalls and the low hush of servants whispering in the corridor. She stared into the dark basin of the fountain for a long while, watching the moonlight ripple across the water's surface. Her reflection wavered there, softened and broken by the slight stir of breeze. She looked at herself, not with vanity, but with a strange kind of curiosity. As if trying to recognize the woman who now lived in this story she had never meant to begin. In her chambers, the stola was folded and set aside with care, her hair slowly unpinned by the same hands that had once dressed her for a simpler life. She climbed into bed alone, the linen cool against her skin, and lay in the dark with her thoughts wide awake. Outside, the garden was still fragrant with jasmine. The walls still bore the warmth of the day's sun. And somewhere not too far, in another room she would never see, he too was lying awake. That she felt certain of. It was a small certainty, but in that moment, it was enough. The next morning unfolded with the kind of reluctant grace that only follows an evening filled with too many words, too many eyes, and not enough sleep. She rose early, not out of habit, but out of necessity. The stillness of dawn was the only time she felt safe enough to think without performing. The sky beyond her window was a soft, empty grey, the kind that arrives just before the rooftops begin to glow. A servant girl knocked lightly, asking whether she would like warm water brought in. She replied with a simple yes, her voice composed, smooth. The girl nodded and disappeared. Everything was normal. That was the trick. Make everything appear normal, even if nothing inside felt remotely the same. As she moved through the villa, her footsteps careful and slow, she found herself caught in the echo of things unsaid. The conversation in the garden had been brief, cautious, spoken more in glances than in language. But it lingered. Not the words, but the weight. He had looked tired, not merely weary, but the kind of tired that settles behind the eyes, where only those who truly know a person can see it. She had wanted to ask him then, in that sliver of night that belonged only to them, whether he was still certain of the path they were walking. But there hadn't been time. There was never time. She paused near the window overlooking the eastern side of the garden. From here she could see the worn stone bench where they had stood. It was empty now, half covered in morning shade and speckled with petals that had fallen overnight. She watched a small bird dip its beak into the fountain, then flutter off toward the roofline, a tiny weight lifted into the open air, with no one to stop it. There was a strange peace in that, watching something move freely where she could not. Later that day, a message arrived, a folded piece of parchment tucked between the handles of a wine amphora delivered from a merchant house in Trastevere. It was passed to her by the steward without ceremony. She accepted it with the same casual ease she used for inventories and payment requests. Once alone, she unfolded it carefully. There was no signature. There never was, just a few lines, fewer than usual. The script was hurried, though still neat. 3 days after sundown, same place. Be cautious. She read it twice, then burned it in the small brazier in her dressing room, watching the edges curl into black and rise like smoke into the stone chimney above. The embers hissed softly as they devoured the last of the ink. She stood over them for a long moment, her hand still hovering near the heat, as if waiting for something to emerge from the flames. But there was nothing. Only the silence that followed and the knowledge that they had just set a clock into motion again. 3 days. It sounded simple, but in this world, in this life, 3 days held room for everything to change. She would wait, of course. She had done it before. But as she moved through the corridors that afternoon, watching her own reflection stretch and shrink along the walls, she couldn't shake the sense that something invisible had already shifted. Not between them, but around them. Like wind in the trees before a storm, it was there, just barely, a tremble in the air, a breath not yet exhaled. The 3 days passed with a peculiar slowness, the kind that stretches each hour wider than the one before. From the outside, they looked unremarkable. The villa continued to pulse with its regular rhythm, laundry laid across sun-warmed stones, the clink of amphorae in the storeroom, the polite hum of household obligations fulfilled with predictable grace. But within her, a quiet current of alertness ran steadily beneath every action. She noticed details she might otherwise have ignored. The way the steward paused slightly before speaking, how the cook's boy glanced too quickly away when she entered the kitchen, how even the olive trees in the garden rustled more than usual in the windless afternoon. On the second day, she passed through the atrium just as 2 visitors were departing. One, a senator's cousin, the other, a retired officer whose name she could never quite remember. They bowed with the appropriate respect, and she responded in kind, but as they turned to leave, she caught a brief exchange of words between them. Not loud, not directed toward her, but just enough. Something about the gathering, something about her. She didn't catch the full sentence, only the tone, and that was enough to leave a trace of unease in her chest for the rest of the day. It was the tone people used when they thought they knew something, but didn't want to admit it openly. That tone, quiet and sharpened at the edges, could spread through Rome faster than a plague. By the 3rd day, the unease had settled into something colder. Not quite fear, but but a tautness in her spine, a readiness for something she could not name. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long fingers of gold across the marble floor, she dressed deliberately. Her gown was simple, a pale saffron with no embroidery, no fine metal threading to catch the eye. Her hair pinned with only one ornament, a copper clasp, shaped like a leaf. She looked like any woman preparing for a calm evening. That was the point. She dismissed her handmaid early, explaining she had a headache and wished for quiet. The girl offered concern but didn't linger. It was believable enough. Everyone knew the household had been unusually active in recent weeks. A woman might reasonably need stillness, but once the room was empty and the outer door drawn closed with a soft click, she crossed to the corner of her chamber and lifted the loose panel from the wall. Behind it, tucked neatly between a spare sash and a folded shawl, lay a small pouch containing a key, worn smooth at the handle. She held it for a moment in her palm, not because she doubted, but because she knew what it meant. It was not simply a key to a storeroom or a locked door. It was a key to a decision they had both made without ever naming it aloud. When the sky had deepened into that tender stretch of dusk between lavender and charcoal, she stepped out into the rear courtyard. The path was quiet, lit by a crescent moon and the gentle flicker of wall-mounted lamps. Her sandals barely made a sound as she moved along the stone walkway, past the trellis of blooming vines and through the narrow gate that led beyond the garden wall. Her steps were steady, her face was calm, but every breath carried the pulse of something unspoken. She didn't know who might be watching, if anyone. She only knew that if she did not go tonight, everything would begin to crumble, quietly at first, then completely. And so she walked forward into the deepening shadows, the key warm in her palm, and the night waiting just ahead. The walk from her garden gate to the meeting place was not far, though it felt longer than usual. The streets were mostly quiet, but not empty. In Rome, the silence of night was never total. Somewhere, always, a door creaked open, a clay pot shifted on a windowsill, a voice muttered something to the dark. Shadows moved as people passed behind curtained windows. She kept to the edges of the path, her steps precise, her gaze steady but never inviting. This part of the city, close enough to the hill to be respectable but far enough from the Palatine to avoid unwanted notice, was familiar to her. Yet tonight it felt unfamiliar in the way that even a well-known room might feel strange in the dark. She reached the side passage behind the bathhouse just as the moon had reached its highest arc. It cast the alley in a dim silver glow, not quite bright enough to guide her, but enough to outline the worn edges of the stones underfoot. The key, still clenched in her palm, felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it opened. She slipped it into the gate, listening for the soft scrape of metal on metal, and turned it carefully. The lock gave without resistance. That had always been part of their understanding. No barriers, no pauses. Once the gate was open, it stayed open for her. Inside was the storeroom, though calling it that made it sound far more functional than it was. The space had been cleared long ago of amphorae and crates. Instead, a low couch stood along one wall, draped with a cloth of dull red. A single oil lamp sat on a shelf, its wick trimmed and ready. She lit it with the flint she kept hidden in her sash and watched the small flame catch and grow. Its light threw flickering shadows across the walls, warming the cold stone with a soft, wavering glow. She waited, as they had agreed. If he came, he would enter from the other side, through the service corridor that wound behind the bathhouse kitchens. No one used it anymore, except a few older staff too, set in their ways to change their habits. It was a perfect path for someone needing to go unseen. She sat on the couch and breathed deeply, her hands folded in her lap. The flame of the lamp bent slightly in the draught, but she remained still, her eyes fixed on the door across the room. Her thoughts did not race. They never did at moments like this. Instead, they flattened into a single, steady awareness. She felt the cool stone beneath her, the warmth of the lamp against her cheek, the faint scent of old cedarwood and wine-soaked cloth that clung to the corners of the storeroom. And she waited. When the door finally opened, it did so with a gentle sigh, no creak, no sudden movement, just a presence entering quietly, as if this space had simply welcomed him in without needing to ask. He stepped into the light, his expression unreadable at first, his shoulders carrying the weight of too many silences. She stood, not rushing, not hesitating, and met him at the center of the room. No words passed between them. They didn't need them. The air between their bodies did all the speaking. There was urgency, yes, but it was the kind that had learned patience. The kind that waits not because it wants to, but because it must. He reached for her, and she allowed herself to be drawn into that familiar space where time shrinks and everything else disappears. For a moment, they existed in a world reduced to breath, touch, and the soft flicker of lamplight on stone. For a moment, the rules of Rome did not apply. Only the quiet truth of their closeness remained. They remained there for what felt like hours, though time inside the storeroom didn't behave the way it did outside. The narrow walls muffled the world, softening every sound except their own breathing. The oil lamp, untouched since it was lit, cast a flickering warmth across the room that made the stone look less like walls and more like the inside of something living. She had once told him, only half in jest, that this space felt like the belly of some great beast where they had been swallowed to hide. He had smiled when she said it, a real smile, not the careful one he wore around his father's clients, or the shallow curve he used when walking the streets with other men of his name. Here, he was different, softer, quieter, almost fragile, and she never said so aloud, but it made her love him more. After their initial embrace, they sat on the low couch, close but no longer touching, each with a hand resting between them as if to hold the space still. He spoke first, his voice low and rough with exhaustion. Not from the day itself, but from the weeks and months that had begun to blur together into a weight he could no longer name. He told her about the senator who had mentioned her in passing 2 nights before. Nothing direct, nothing that could be pinned to truth. Just a small comment during a toast disguised as humor, quickly dismissed with a sip of wine. But he had felt it. The shift, the way it landed and did not disappear, even as the room moved on. She listened without flinching, her expression calm, her hands folded in her lap. Inside, a chill moved through her, slow and deliberate. Not panic, not yet. But the kind of cold that comes when you realize the shadows have grown longer than you thought. He watched her carefully as he spoke, his eyes scanning her face for something, though he didn't say what. Perhaps he was hoping to find reassurance. Perhaps he feared disappointment. She gave him neither. Instead, she leaned in slightly and asked the question that had hovered between them for longer than either had dared admit. "What would you do?" she asked quietly. "If someone truly knew?" He didn't answer right away. His hand moved to hers, rested there gently, and his thumb traced a small, slow circle across her skin. Then he said with a voice that felt more like a confession than a plan, "I don't know." It was not the answer she had wanted, but it was the only one he could give. and in a strange way it comforted her more than any bold promise ever could have. Because bold promises had a habit of breaking in Rome. They shattered against politics and bloodlines, against duty and the endless expectations of fathers with legacies to preserve. But this uncertainty, this raw honesty, it was real, and it meant he was still with her in this, wherever it might lead. They sat for a while longer, not speaking, not needing to. Outside, the night wore on. Somewhere in the city, the watch passed by with their torches, their footsteps echoing faintly through the distant streets. Inside the storeroom, the lamp flickered and hissed, casting soft light across their joined hands. Eventually she rested her head against his shoulder, and he leaned into her lightly, just enough. They didn't speak of plans, they didn't speak of tomorrow. Not because they didn't care, but because some moments could only exist in the present. And this, quiet and flickering, was one of them. Time slipped past them gently in the storeroom, as if even the gods had agreed to turn their gaze for a little while. The oil lamp burned lower now, casting longer shadows that reached across the walls like fingers stretching to hold on to something already fading. She didn't speak, and neither did he. Their silence wasn't born from discomfort, but from something more fragile and precious, a mutual understanding that words, in this moment, would only diminish what was already known. Her head remained on his shoulder, and he had not moved, not shifted under the weight of her trust or the slow rhythm of her breathing against his side. It was one of the rare instances where their togetherness required nothing, no performance, no caution, only presence. But Rome never waited. Even when hidden behind stone and shadow, the city had a way of pressing in, reminding those who dared to step beyond its strict expectations that time was not theirs to control. A distant bell echoed faintly across the night, a soft chime marking the hour for some distant temple or shrine. It was a sound so light it barely brushed the air, yet it carried meaning for them both. He stirred slightly beneath her, not with impatience, but with the reluctant awareness that they were near the end of their borrowed time. She sat upright, brushing her hair back from her face with slow fingers. Her eyes found the lamp, its flame now a thin, wavering line. In its glow, his face looked older, not by years but by burden. She had never asked him about the full weight of his days, what was expected of him, what decisions waited in shadowed rooms where his voice was only one among many. But she had always sensed it, and now it showed clearly in the way his shoulders sloped forward, not from defeat, but from the constant brace against a future already being shaped for him. He rose without a word and moved to the far door. She watched him check the latch and press an ear to the wood, listening for footsteps in the corridor beyond. His movements were quiet, practiced. They had done this enough to have fallen into a routine, but tonight there was a new stillness in his motion, a kind of heaviness that did not match the hour. When he turned back to her, his expression was unreadable. She stood as well, not needing his words to know it was time to go. She gathered her things with a calm so practiced it felt natural, even when her heart was no longer cooperating. At the door, they hesitated. There were no vows exchanged, no foolish declarations of love that couldn't survive the light of day. But there was a look, one held just a heartbeat longer than it should have been. It said enough. That they would meet again, yes. That they were still choosing this despite everything, but also that both of them had begun to understand the space tightening around them, the kind of danger that didn't roar or arrive with soldiers, the kind that tiptoed, that whispered. He left first, slipping into the corridor and vanishing into the dim passage like smoke dispersing into air. She waited until his footsteps faded completely, then stepped out into the coolness of night, the scent of cypress clinging faintly to her cloak. The stars were still out, but they looked different now, not farther, not closer, just colder. As she closed the garden gate behind her, her hand lingered on the latch for a moment longer than necessary. Then she let it go, returning to a house that would never ask questions and a life that could no longer hold the answers. Morning returned to the villa with the slow insistence of a guest who did not knock, who let themselves in without announcement and expected to be welcomed. The sunlight that fell through the high windows was pale and low, as if even the sun had risen cautiously, uncertain of the mood it might find in the world below. She had not slept well. Her body had rested, yes, and her limbs had obeyed the stillness of night, but her mind had circled itself for hours. Long after she had slipped back through the quiet gate and folded away her cloak, she had lain in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the small cracks in the plaster, and wondering how long this could go on before something cracked wider than either of them could repair. Her maid arrived with warm water and a tray of soaked bread and fresh cheese. The girl said little, sensing perhaps that this morning was not one for questions. She had learned over the years that her mistress was a woman who wore silence as naturally as others wore jewelry. And so the tray was placed carefully on the low table, and the room was left undisturbed once more. Alone again, she sat beside the window, fingers wrapped around the edge of the cup, though she did not drink. She watched the way the light moved across the tiles, the way shadows lengthened and shrank as if the day itself were unsure how to behave. The message came just before midday, tucked into a folded length of cloth brought by a linen merchant who passed through the villa gates as if by routine. No one noticed. It was the same man who had delivered bolts of fabric to the household for years. The steward greeted him by name. The guards did not glance twice. Inside the cloth, rolled tightly and secured with a thin leather band, was a slip of parchment no wider than a finger. The handwriting was not his, which meant the message had travelled through at least one other person, perhaps two. That alone made her uneasy. Layers meant risk. Layers meant that things were growing more complicated than either of them had intended. She read it once, slowly, then again with her lips parted just enough to breathe. It was not long, but it said enough. A name, a meeting, a suggestion that someone close had begun to ask quiet questions. Nothing certain, not yet, but certain enough to be felt. She read it a third time before slipping it into the small brazier and lighting the corner with a dry splinter. The parchment curled at the edges and blackened quickly, the ink fading into ash before the words could settle too deeply in her memory. The afternoon passed slowly, heavy with the knowledge that a shift had begun. She moved through her tasks as she always did, correcting a servant girl's placement of the oil jars, inspecting the storeroom inventory, offering a brief, gracious smile to a neighbour who arrived with news of a festival on the Aventine. But none of it sat comfortably. Each conversation felt slightly off-key, each gesture a little too deliberate. Her thoughts pulled constantly toward what might come next, what step they would need to take if the quiet questions became louder ones. And always, beneath the surface, the simple truth remained. They had crossed into something that could no longer be hidden forever. As twilight crept once more across the villa walls and the orange hue of sunset slipped between the tall shutters, she stood at her window, the breeze brushing her skin like a whispered warning. Somewhere, he too would be reading the same message, burning the same ink into ash. Somewhere, he too would be wondering how long they had, before someone no longer asked, quietly, That evening, she remained by the window longer than usual. The air was cooler now, touched with the faintest scent of smoke drifting from a nearby hearth, and beneath it, something sweeter, maybe laurel, maybe crushed fig leaves, from the villa garden below. It was the kind of scent that reminded her of early autumn, of the slow bend into the season when Rome quieted just slightly, when the crowds shifted from rowdy to restless. She watched the sky deepen from gold to violet, the rooftops darkening in jagged lines against the horizon, and thought of him. She wondered if he too was standing at a window, palms resting on the sill, eyes scanning the same sky with the same unease settling in his chest. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. Fear would have required something more immediate. Guards at the door, a scroll unfurled with accusations in ink. No, this was different. This was a kind of knowing, a sense that the air itself had changed texture, that even the safe spaces in their lives now carried echoes that could betray them. She could feel it in the way people had begun to pause, just slightly too long, before speaking her name, in the way even the servants moved with a shade more caution, as if instinct alone had told them that something delicate and dangerous was being kept just out of sight. Later, after the lamps were lit and the household had settled into its nighttime rhythm, she sat alone in the triclinium, a cup of diluted wine warming in her hand. The room was quiet except for the slow trickle of water from the fountain in the wall. A breeze stirred the curtain beside her, lifting it briefly before letting it fall again, and the candle flame danced softly on the table, casting an amber light across her knuckles and the rim of the cup. She thought of the name written in the note, the person who had started asking questions. It was a name she knew well, one that had been spoken often at dinners and passed casually in conversation, a man with no obvious malice, but a sharpness behind his smile that she had always noticed, even when others dismissed it as wit. The message had not said why he had begun to wonder, only that he had. And in Rome, as that was always enough, because in a city that lived on secrets and appearances, wonder was a dangerous seed. Once planted, it did not rest. It grew in the minds of those who watered it with curiosity, with envy, with the simple pleasure of uncovering something hidden. And if it flowered into truth, there would be no shelter left for them, no space safe enough to hold what they shared. She sipped the wine slowly, barely tasting it. Her fingers curled around the cup, not for warmth, but for steadiness. In the quiet of that room, beneath the glow of the candle, she considered what it would mean to step away, to end it, to close the gate one last time and never unlock it again. The thought passed through her mind, not as a threat, but as a possibility, like a door she might choose not to open. And yet, even as she sat there, trying to imagine a life without the weight of this secret, without the quiet thrill of that shared glance, that breathless risk, she knew. She knew that some connections were not chosen in full. Some were woven into the quiet spaces of the soul before logic could undo them. And hers was already woven too tightly to be pulled free without tearing something she would never quite repair. The following morning brought no rain, no storm, no messenger pounding at the gate with urgent parchment. The world outside her window wore the same face it always had, sunlight dappling the inner courtyard, the slow clatter of morning chores, the distant sound of a vendor's voice trailing along the streets. Yet beneath all that was the unmistakable tension of a still thread being pulled tighter. Nothing had broken, not yet, but something in her told her it was close. She moved through her tasks as though suspended slightly above them, present in motion, but untethered in thought. She listened to the steward report on the arrival of olive oil from Antium, gave her approval for 2 additional loaves to be baked for the coming Saturnalia feast, even discussed the arrangement of chairs for a visiting guest who might attend a poetry recital in the garden, though the guest, she suspected, would never come. Her voice remained calm, her eyes alert but soft, the way one learns to be after years of watching from the periphery. But even as she nodded and gave instructions, her mind strayed again to the name in the message and the undercurrent of risk that now pulsed beneath every ordinary word. By midday, she allowed herself a short moment alone in the far corner of the garden. A small bench there, hidden beneath a flowering arch, had long been her sanctuary. Not even her closest attendants came near it unless called. She sat with her back to the house, letting the vines obscure her figure just enough, the scent of crushed thyme and sun-warmed stone filling the air around her. It was here that she allowed herself to recall his voice in full, the way he had said her name only once the night they met in the storeroom, low and certain, like it was not a question, but an answer. It was a sound that never echoed, only settled, tucked somewhere behind her ribs, where she carried it like a thread of warmth. She had not seen him since that night. That was the rule. They never met 2 nights in succession, never passed messages in daylight, never left anything written longer than a name or a date. But today she wished for one break in that rhythm, one stolen word, one glance through a crowd, something to confirm that he too was carrying the weight of what was coming, that the silence between them was not indifference, but a shield. A bird landed near her feet, tilted its head, then flew off again, startled by a breeze that swept across the courtyard. She followed its flight with her eyes, tracing the soft line of its movement until it disappeared beyond the villa wall. That wall, once a comfort, now felt too thin. She thought of the eyes that might already be watching. Not servants, not neighbors, but those who made it their trade to watch without being seen. She knew how such men moved, had seen them once trailing a disgraced wife through the portico of a temple before she vanished from all mention within the month. There was no safety in names, not here, not in Rome, and certainly not when spoken between people like them. She rose quietly from the bench, brushing her hand over the stone as if to press something back into it, something too dangerous to carry with her. Then she returned through the garden path, slipping once more into the house, where her name still held power, where her place was still respected, and where everything appeared, at least for now, unchanged. The light was beginning to tilt by the time she returned inside, the sun stretching the shadows of the columns across the stone floor like long ribbons drawn by unseen hands. The villa was quieter now. The servants had slipped into the soft rhythm of late tasks, polishing bronze fixtures, folding laundered cloth, preparing the evening fire with dried olive branches that crackled faintly when disturbed. She moved through it all with the grace of someone accustomed to presence without disruption, her sandals making only the faintest sound as she passed from the garden entrance to her private rooms. Once alone, she pulled the window shutters slightly ajar, letting in a soft thread of gold that touched the far wall in a slow cascade. The silence here was her own, and in it she let herself truly feel the undercurrent she had been suppressing for days. The fear hadn't grown into panic, not yet, but it had matured into something more refined, a sense of waiting, of holding one's breath too long beneath the surface of the water. She sat at her small writing table, not to write, but to think. Her fingers traced the edge of a scroll container worn smooth by time and touch. She had once stored letters there, not his. Those had always been burned, but older ones, letters from her youth, written in a thinner, more hopeful hand. She hadn't opened them in years. She didn't need to. She remembered their contents, not as words, but as feelings, little fragments of a version of herself that no longer moved through the world. A light knock at the door startled her, though she masked it quickly. It was only the steward, asking whether she would like the evening lamps lit or preferred the room to remain dim. She thanked him and asked for only one lamp, and that it be placed near the window. He bowed slightly and left without hesitation, his footsteps receding into the corridor like a fading echo. When the lamp was brought, its flame filled the corner with a soft, warm pulse that made the shadows dance along the plaster walls. She stared into the light for a long while, letting the flicker soothe her mind even as her thoughts spiraled deeper. It was almost time. Not for a meeting, not tonight, but for a decision. One neither of them had dared speak of directly, but which had taken shape in the spaces between their glances, in the pauses after every embrace. It hovered around, them now like the scent of smoke before fire, not dangerous yet, but impossible to ignore. If the man from the message, if he continued asking, continued watching, then it would no longer be a matter of waiting for discovery. It would be a matter of choosing how to survive it. She rose and crossed to the far corner of her room where an old chest sat beneath a tapestry. She hadn't opened it in months. Inside were things no longer part of her daily life, a worn shawl from her mother's house, a carved comb from her first journey to Ostia, and beneath them the small ivory figure of Fortuna she had been given as a girl. It was smooth and cool in her hand, the face nearly faded, but she held it nonetheless. Not to pray. She had long stopped believing the gods intervened in the affairs of those too quiet to be heroes, but she held it because it reminded her that there had once been a time when she believed luck was something she could hold, something she could keep. She replaced it gently, closed the chest, and turned back to the window. The light was nearly gone now, the sky deepening into its soft indigo hush. In the distance, someone's wind chime sang lightly in the breeze, a delicate, trembling sound like glass tapping glass. She stood still, breathing it in, steadying herself for whatever would come next. Night returned with its usual softness, cloaking the villa in the hush of quiet routines and low-burning lamps. She remained by the window for longer than she realized, her hand lightly resting against the sill, the breeze brushing across her skin with a chill that did not belong to the weather alone. Below, the garden was quiet, the vines still, the fig trees' broad leaves unmoving in the still air. The silence was not peace. It was the kind of silence that came when things that should be spoken were being swallowed whole. She had known it before as a girl, watching her mother maneuver through rooms full of men with sharp voices and sharper intentions. She knew the difference between stillness and safety. This was not safety. She turned away finally and let the shutters fall closed with a soft thud. In the flickering lamplight, the room seemed smaller than before. Not cramped, but enclosed, as if the very air had thickened. She poured herself a cup of water from the clay pitcher beside her bed and drank slowly, trying to quiet the noise within. It wasn't panic, it was more precise than that. A kind of awareness in the bones, as if her body understood something her thoughts had only begun to catch up to. She was being watched, not in the obvious way, not by servants or street voices or casual neighbors. This was deeper, quieter. The kind of watching that didn't announce itself but lingered in the corners, gathering shape behind gestures and silences. There had been signs even before the message. A question too casually placed in conversation, a comment from a cousin's wife, about her routine walks through the eastern corridor. Of the garden, said, with the lilt of curiosity masked as compliment. And then, earlier that week, a face she didn't recognize standing too long near the entrance to the marketplace, watching her carriage pass with no effort to hide it. Just standing, present, as though his only task was to be seen being still. It wasn't confirmation, but it was enough. And now the question pressed harder than ever. What would she do? Not what they would do. That was the trap she had been careful not to fall into. There could be no they when consequence came. Rome didn't punish couples. It punished the one without power. And in their world, power was inherited, purchased, secured in names and land, and alliances brokered over bloodlines. He would suffer, yes, if they were caught. But he would survive it? Bruised, perhaps, disgraced briefly. But he would return eventually to whatever future had already been written for him. She would not. The thought did not bring bitterness. She had known it from the start. It was a truth she had never tried to soften, not even in the quietest moments of closeness between them. But tonight, the truth settled heavier than before. Not because it had changed, but because it had begun to move. To shift from possibility into probability. She placed the cup down gently, then crossed to the small table near her bed, where her writing tablet lay. She didn't often write anything she intended to keep. But now she hesitated. Not to write to him. That would be too dangerous. Instead, she began to draft something for herself. Words to clarify what her mind could no longer afford to leave fogged. Not instructions, not goodbye, but a shape. A record of the choice she had made and the line she would not cross if the day came that someone asked. The stylus moved slowly at first, then steadier. Outside, the wind stirred faintly, lifting the corner of the curtain just once before settling again. She paused, looked up, then back at the wax tablet. And without knowing exactly why, she wiped it clean. Some things were better remembered only in silence. By morning, the wax tablet was blank again, its surface smooth beneath her fingertips, as if the thought had never existed. She placed it back in its wooden casing and tucked it among the scrolls in the far corner of the cabinet, a small gesture of control in a world where so much now leaned beyond it. The day stretched open, indifferent to her night's unraveling, and with it came the expected duties. She met them with the same practiced ease, her steps measured, her voice steady. No one noticed anything different. That was how she knew she was still safe. In Rome, you were in danger only when someone began to notice. As the household moved into the rhythms of the early day, a knock came at the front entrance. The steward greeted the caller, a man of middle years with the air of someone used to not being asked many questions. He handed over a small pouch of coins, a gesture that might have been nothing more than business. But when the steward brought it to her, he mentioned that the man had not offered a name, only a nod, and that he had walked away without waiting for thanks. It might have been an errand for someone else in the house, but something in the steward's tone, polite though uncertain, told her he had wondered. She accepted the pouch with a calm nod and tucked it into her sleeve. Inside, hidden between the coins, was a scrap of parchment, smaller than usual, barely the size of her palm. The ink was faint, as if written in haste or secrecy, perhaps both. Just 2 words, 2 places, no date, no name, no instruction. But she understood them. They were the names of streets, narrow ones, each flanking opposite ends of a single block, not far from the old forum. They were paths diverging, a signal. He had sent her a choice. The thought rattled quietly beneath her surface for the rest of the day. She did not answer it, Not yet. She stored it away behind the tilt of her chin, behind the polite smile she offered a neighbour who dropped in to share idle gossip about a magistrate's latest affair. It felt strange now, hearing the stories whispered behind fans and over sweet wine. Affairs so openly mocked, so easily dissected by women who would never imagine their own lives might brush up against such risk. And yet there she sat, still and composed, nodding gently, laughing where expected, while her own secret lived just beneath the table's edge. As evening came, she walked the garden alone, not because she needed the air, but because she needed to move through something familiar. The stones beneath her feet had memorized her pattern. The vines above seemed to lean forward slightly, as though they too had begun to listen more closely. She paused near the bench and touched the back of it with her hand, as if to draw strength from its cool surface. It was here that they had once first spoken in full, not in fragments, not behind closed doors, but with eyes wide open and the weight of decision still far enough away to feel harmless. She closed her eyes for a moment and inhaled. The scent of rosemary clung to the edges of the air, mixed with the last breath of sun-warmed stone. She let it linger in her lungs before releasing it slowly, her hand still resting on the bench. When she turned back toward the house, the sky behind the roof had begun to fade into soft rose and grey, a quiet folding of the day into memory. The parchment in her sleeve pressed against her skin with every step. 2 streets, 2 directions, and somewhere between them, a question she could no longer put aside. She slept lightly that night, if one could call it sleep at all. Her body obeyed the stillness of the bed, her limbs folded beneath the weight of linen sheets, but her thoughts never quite stopped unraveling. Somewhere in the corner of her mind, the 2 street names continued to echo, not loud or urgent, but insistent, as if they had their own quiet pulse. She didn't need a map to picture them. She had walked both more than once over the years, sometimes alone, sometimes trailing behind a procession, other times seated in a covered litter. The cloth curtain parted just enough to glimpse the world without fully belonging to it. She knew where each one led. More importantly, she knew what they meant. By dawn, her decision was still unsettled, but the weight of it had found a resting place in her chest. She rose earlier than usual, the sky outside still painted in the cool greys of pre-dawn. The house was silent, save for the faint creak of a servant moving in the kitchen far below. She dressed without help, pulling her hair back into a single braid and tying it with a plain ribbon. Her gown was modest, a soft cream dyed from crushed shells and earth pigment, the hem slightly worn from years of careful mending. It was not the attire of a woman planning to be seen, but rather of someone needing to pass unnoticed. She stepped outside through the east corridor, moving past the columns with a familiar rhythm that didn't rush. There was no need for haste. To walk quickly in Rome drew attention, but to move with purpose, quietly and early, suggested devotion or errands or mourning, none of which prompted questions. The guard at the outer gate nodded without interest. He had seen her walk this path many times before and did not mark this morning as any different. That was the safety she had spent years cultivating, the illusion of predictability. The streets were quiet, the city still rubbing the sleep from its eyes. Bread makers were beginning to stoke their ovens, sending thin trails of smoke upward to catch the morning light. A few vendors shuffled crates into position, their voices low as they greeted one another with sleepy gestures. She passed them without pause, her cloak drawn loosely around her shoulders, the parchment still folded in her palm. She didn't look at it again. There was no need, It wasn't the directions she needed reminding of, it was the meaning. When she reached the edge of the old forum, she turned slightly and paused beneath the overhang of a shaded arcade. From there, she could see both streets, their entrances like open questions laid out before her. One was lined with market stalls and small shops, always bustling after mid-morning. The other curved more sharply, dipping down into a narrower, quieter lane bordered by old stone walls that hadn't been cleaned in years. The choice was not about the path itself, but about what waited at the end of each one. She remained there for a while, allowing the moment to settle around her. Birds flitted from rooftop to rooftop above, calling out in bursts, their wings catching the morning light in sudden flashes. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, though the sound was distant and quickly swallowed by the city's waking breath. She looked from one street to the other, and then closed her eyes. When she opened them, she stepped forward, not quickly, not with finality, but with the quiet strength of someone who understood that some choices are not made once, but every step after. She chose the quieter lane, the one that dipped gently downhill and curled away from the center of morning activity. Her steps were slow but firm, and the moment she passed beneath the low arch at its entrance, the air seemed to shift. It was cooler here, shaded by old stone buildings that leaned just slightly inward as if trying to hear one another's secrets across the narrow way. Moss grew in thin lines along the base of the walls, and the scent of damp earth lingered in the air, mixed faintly with traces of soot and iron. This was not a route for casual strollers. It was a place people passed through quickly unless they had reason to linger, and today she did. Her eyes swept the length of the passage, not with suspicion, but with a quiet kind of vigilance. She didn't expect to see him waiting here. He would never be so careless. But she had learned to trust the signals they left for one another. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be traced. Just a pattern of pebbles beneath a certain window, a smear of ochre on a cornerstone, a sliver of cloth caught in a splintered gate. These were the words they used now, each one a whisper of intent in a world too loud with danger. And today, as she passed beneath the arch of the third doorway, she saw it. A single olive leaf pressed against the base of the column, as if dropped by chance. Except it hadn't been. She stopped, adjusted her cloak slightly as if brushing dust from the hem, and moved on. Her destination was near, a small abandoned courtyard once used for deliveries, now little more than uneven cobbles and overgrown ivy. No one came here anymore. It had once served the kitchen of a wealthy merchant's villa, but the family had long since moved across the river, and what remained had been left to the city's slow erosion. It was perfect. It had always been perfect, hidden in plain sight, forgotten by nearly all except them. When she stepped inside, the air seemed to still. Not silent, but paused, as though even the morning waited to see what she would do next. The walls rose high around the space, their plaster faded, the mural along one surface barely visible now. Just the faint outline of a vase, a curl of vine. Vine, the ghost of a figure reaching for something that was no longer there. She moved toward the far side, where a stone bench sat beneath the shade of a drooping tree, its branches low and dusted with dry blossoms that trembled when the wind stirred. He was already there. He didn't rise when she entered. He didn't need to. His eyes met hers with a calm so steady it felt like an anchor thrown into the sea. She crossed the distance between them without speaking, and when she finally sat, their silence was not awkward. It was full. It was the kind of silence that follows sleepless nights and unanswered messages, the kind that holds everything words would only make thinner. For a long time, neither of them moved, Then slowly he reached into his cloak and withdrew a folded piece of cloth, not large, but thickly wrapped. She took it without question, her fingers brushing his. The fabric held something solid inside, and when she opened it, she saw it was not what she had expected. No letter, no token. But a coin, old, tarnished, heavy. She looked up at him, confused, but he only nodded slightly and said very quietly, "It's begun." And with that, the morning around them seemed to shift once more. She turned the coin over in her hand, feeling its weight press gently into her palm. It was not an ordinary coin, not one that would pass easily from buyer to vendor in the open markets. Its edges were dulled but still carried the faint remnants of a private seal. One she recognized not because she had seen it before in trade, but because it was a symbol whispered about in certain conversations that stopped as soon as footsteps approached. A mark of one of the lesser senatorial families that had fallen out of favor years ago, their lands seized, their name quietly erased from records. And yet here it was again, resurfacing in her hand as if the past had clawed its way back into the present. She looked up, her brow furrowed slightly, questions pressing against her chest like birds in a cage. He watched her with that same quiet expression, one that always made her feel like he was standing 2 steps ahead of her, but never pulling away. "They're moving pieces again," he said, his voice low, the words folding into the stillness of the courtyard. "Not just watching, acting, testing the edges to see where the silence breaks first." He leaned back slightly, his hands resting against the cool stone behind him. "The coin was left at my father's meeting table. No one claimed it. But it wasn't dropped. It was placed, deliberately." She understood the meaning even before he continued. A message disguised as carelessness. An invitation or a threat, perhaps both. In Rome, the two were often the same. She looked down at the coin again and saw not the symbol, not even the history it carried, but the network of consequences now spiraling out from its presence. If someone wanted that seal to be seen again, they were not just playing with memory, they were playing with power. And if it had found its way to him, it would not be long before it found its way to her. The bench beneath her felt colder now, as if the stone had pulled the warmth from her through the fabric of her gown. She tucked the coin back into the cloth, folding it carefully before slipping it into her sleeve. She didn't ask him who he suspected. That question belonged to another time, a safer one. Now the only question that mattered was what came next. He watched her with a steadiness that felt almost like sorrow. "You still have time," he said softly, "to step back, to close the gate." She smiled then, not with joy, but with the kind of clarity that comes when fear turns into resolve. "I had time last year. I had time that first morning in the garden. I have only direction now." And it was true. The choice had never been about whether she would follow the path, only about how far she would walk before someone tried to stop her. A gust of wind stirred the courtyard, rustling the trees' tired branches and sending a scattering of pale blossoms drifting across the stones. One of them landed near his foot, and he glanced down at it absently, as though unsure whether to brush it away or leave it where it had fallen. "There's a meeting tomorrow," he said. "They'll speak of names, quietly of course. But it's the beginning. I'll try to redirect, delay, but you must be ready." She nodded. Her fingers curled slightly, instinctively, as if preparing to hold on to something tighter. And for the first time, she realized the city no longer felt familiar. It felt like a stage built for someone else's play, and she had stumbled behind the curtain at the wrong moment. She didn't answer him right away. The air between them had shifted, not in anger or fear, but in understanding. The kind that comes when two people reach a place words cannot really hold. Her gaze drifted past him for a moment, to the mural that still clung stubbornly to the old plaster wall. It had once shown a goddess, she thought perhaps Ceres or Vesta, her arms outstretched over a harvest too faded now to make out. Only the shape of her form remained, a vague outline standing guard over stone and time. It struck her that even paint, once praised and protected, was subject to disappearance. Rome remembered only what it needed to. The rest was surrendered to weather and whisper. She folded her hands in her lap, the cloth-wrapped coin pressing lightly against her wrist through the folds of her gown. That weight stayed with her, quiet but present, like a breath that never fully left the body. He had given her this piece of warning, not as a demand, not even as a plea. It had been an offering. A gesture meant not to burden her, but to place her firmly in the truth they had both been circling for weeks. Now the circle had closed. There would be no more pretending this was a secret held only between walls. Rome had caught the scent. He reached for her hand, a slow movement without urgency, and when his fingers brushed hers, the contact was light but certain. She let them rest there, their hands a still moment in a city always in motion. They had not often touched in daylight. The risk had been too sharp, too careless. But here, wrapped in ruin and ivy, they let that boundary dissolve, if only for the time they had left. "I don't know what will happen after tomorrow," he said quietly. "The room I enter may not be the one I leave. These men have long memories when it serves them, and short ones when it does not." She knew the kind of room he meant, the sort with wide tables and narrower eyes, where power was passed not with ceremony, but through silence and subtle nods. The kind where a name could be your shield one morning and your shackle by dusk. And she also knew what it meant for him to walk into such a room with her shadow on his back. He could lose things, not just favor, but legacy, freedom. And yet he didn't ask her to disappear. He only gave her the choice, knowing she would carry it differently than he ever could. "I'm not frightened of the outcome," she said softly, her voice low as the wind. "Only of how it will feel to vanish without explanation." He turned his head slightly, and there was something tender in the lines at the corner of his eyes, something that almost smiled. "You wouldn't vanish. You would shift, and they wouldn't know where to look." They sat like that for a little while longer, listening to the world as it stirred slowly beyond the courtyard walls, the sound of wheels over stone, the far-off clink of metal, the murmur of a city deciding what parts of itself to reveal today. And in that still pocket of time, she realized the decision had already rooted inside her. She would not wait for the city to choose her fate. If they were drawing maps behind closed doors, she would walk a path that left no footprints behind them to follow. When she finally rose, her fingers lingered on his for a breath longer. Then she slipped into the archway without looking back. As she walked away from the courtyard, the world outside greeted her not with suspicion, but with ordinary life unfolding around her, unknowing and unchanged. A cart creaked by carrying bundles of straw. Two boys chased each other across the alley, shouting with a joy that paid no mind to secrets or consequences. The perfume of warm bread drifted from a nearby doorway, and somewhere down the lane, a lyre was being played softly, its notes lazily tumbling over one another in the late morning air. The city seemed to be reminding her that everything continued, that no matter what passed between shadowed stone and whispered glances, Rome itself would remain, and in a strange way that steadied her. She walked without hurrying, her steps measured, deliberate. There was no need to run. Running drew eyes, and eyes were dangerous, so she moved with the calm of someone returning from temple prayer or a merchant visit, nodding once to a fruit seller who offered a basket of figs with a hopeful glance. She did not stop, but her smile was soft enough to not offend. Every moment on the street was a performance now. Every pause or step or turn of the head, a silent line in a story she hoped others would believe without question, and she had long learned how to play her role well. Back at the villa, the gates opened with their usual ease, the servant who greeted her offering a small bow before retreating without further word. Nothing in his eyes hinted that he saw her any differently. That, too, was a comfort. For now. She moved through the familiar halls, brushing her hand lightly along the smooth marble of the corridor, as if to ground herself in its cool certainty. The scent of lavender still lingered from the morning sweep, and somewhere deeper in the house, the distant echo of conversation slipped between walls. She passed by it all and returned to her private quarters, letting the curtain fall softly behind her. Inside, she finally let herself exhale. It was not relief, just release. She crossed to the writing table again, but this time she did not sit. Instead, she reached behind the shelf and pulled a small satchel forward, one she had prepared long ago but had never had cause to open. It held little, just enough. A few coins, a change of clothes, a letter with no seal, but written in her own hand, directions, names, favors, owed from long ago. She had written it during another season of unrest, not knowing whether she would ever use it. Now she wasn't sure if it was meant for escape or warning, only that it might soon matter. The coin still lay hidden in her sleeve. She pulled it out once more, holding it beneath the lamp. In the flicker of gold light, its tarnished surface looked less like metal and more like memory, something unearthed from a place that had been left alone too long. She thought of him again, not just the touch of his hand or the sound of his voice, but the way he had looked at her that morning, as though he were memorizing the shape of her in that moment, just in case. That kind of gaze stayed with a person. Not as guilt, but as weight. Outside, the sky was beginning to change again. Late afternoon brushed a soft warmth across the courtyard tiles, and the olive tree's shadow stretched longer than before. She stepped to the window and watched it sway, listening closely to the way its leaves rustled with the breeze, each one whispering in a voice only she could hear. It was not time to act yet, but the hour was drawing close, and when it came, she would already be standing. The hours passed with the deliberate slowness that often comes when the mind is occupied with 1,000 thoughts, yet the body must remain still. She remained in her quarters for most of the afternoon, stepping out only once to speak with the steward about the delivery of amphorae for the storeroom. He mentioned something about the quantity not matching the order, and she listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, offering the kind of calm, measured response that would assure him nothing was amiss. Her mind was elsewhere entirely, but none of that could be allowed to show. The key now was to maintain the still surface, while beneath it everything began to shift. As evening fell, the temperature dropped slightly, enough to carry a faint bite in the air that drifted through the open lattice of the window. She did not light the lamps right away. Instead, she let the dimming light fill the room naturally, watching as the edges of furniture blurred into shadow and the pale sky took on the deeper blue of twilight. There was comfort in that blur, in the soft dissolving of sharp lines. The world outside her walls would soon be gathering behind doors, Families preparing evening meals, servants setting tables, laughter drifting from hearths where stories would be shared to chase away the chill of night. But within her villa the stillness held. She returned to the small satchel, this time not just to check it, but to begin mentally preparing for the version of herself who might need to carry it. There had always been several versions of her living within the same skin. The one who stood gracefully beside her husband in public, the one who quietly managed the accounts of the household without ever being asked to, the one who remembered the names of every servant's child, though no one expected it. And then the version that had slipped through the garden gate that first night, cloaked not in deception, but in longing. She would need all of them now, every piece sharpened and ready, even the ones that had remained hidden longest. The soft scrape of sandals on stone outside her door drew her attention. She moved to the curtain quietly, listening. It was only the younger maid, the one who usually came in the evening to check on the linens. She made no attempt to enter, only paused, perhaps uncertain whether her presence was needed. The girl's shadow hesitated for a moment longer, then retreated. Even that slight pause felt heavier tonight. Had she lingered to listen? Or simply out of politeness, was impossible to say. But it reminded her that silence could be both protection and danger depending on whose hands it passed through. She waited until darkness settled completely before lighting the lamp, shielding the flame with her hand as it took. The glow cast a warm halo around the room, the kind that made everything seem softer, less immediate. She returned to the window, the same one she always returned to, and looked out across the rooftops. In the distance, she could see a single torch burning near the forum, its light steady in the deepening night. It looked so small from here, so fragile against the vast blue above. And yet it continued to burn. Tomorrow would come quickly. Whether it arrived with questions, or with silence, or with the dull weight of some new truth laid bare, she did not know. But tonight, in this small, flickering light, she allowed herself the one comfort she had not yet surrendered. The knowledge that she had not turned away, not once. Not even when it would have been easier to forget. Morning did not arrive in a rush, but with the slow, careful progression of light inching across stone and cloth and skin. The first rays slipped through the wooden shutters like hesitant fingers, brushing the edge of the table and spilling over the carved arm of the chair where her cloak had been draped the night before. She was already awake, sitting quietly at the foot of the bed, her feet resting bare against the cool floor. Sleep had come in patches, brief, shallow moments that never quite reached the depths she needed. But she hadn't expected rest, not today. She rose without ceremony, washed with chilled water from the basin, and dressed in the pale tunic she reserved for temple days. It was unadorned, clean, and gave her the look of someone seeking answers rather than offering them. Her hair she braided slowly, deliberately, pulling each strand with care, as if the act itself might anchor her. When she tied the ribbon at the end, her hands stilled for a long breath. There was something sacred in ritual, even the mundane ones. They offered shape to what might otherwise collapse beneath its own weight. Below, the villa was already moving. She could hear the sound of clay vessels being lifted and placed, the low murmur of instructions being given in the kitchen, and the heavy stomp of the steward's sandals as he walked the corridor outside the granary. Everything was as it should be. That was the strange part. The surface of her world remained undisturbed. But beneath it, the ground had begun to shift, subtle but undeniable. She could feel it in the pauses between voices, in the glances that lingered a breath too long, in the faint rustle of the olive tree outside her window that seemed to lean closer, as if trying to listen. She took her time with breakfast, though she barely ate. A piece of bread, too dry, a sip of wine, too bitter. The figs looked soft and sweet, but she left them untouched. Her appetite had not returned since the courtyard, and she doubted it would any time soon. The coin, still wrapped in the cloth he had given her, lay hidden beneath the folds of her robe. She did not touch it this morning. Its presence was enough. Just before the hour of third light, a messenger arrived, not one she recognized. He was young, perhaps too young for tasks like this, his tunic too clean, his eyes too wide, but he carried himself with the stiffness of someone who had been warned that even his silence would be watched. He handed her a scroll, unsealed, with only a single line inside. 4 words, written in his hand but dictated by someone else. They meet, all present. No name, no signature. But she knew what it meant. He had kept his word. The gathering was underway. She dismissed the boy with a nod and stepped back into the inner part of her chamber, the scroll still open in her hand. The words didn't say much, but they didn't have to. In them was the shape of the next step. He would be in that room, seated among men who could undo not just their story, but their very presence in one another's lives. She thought about the weight he must be carrying now, the careful tone he'd need to strike, the lines he would have to walk without drawing attention to the wrong question or the wrong glance. And she thought, too, about how alone he must feel in that room, even while surrounded. She moved to the window again, watching the same torch she had seen flickering the night before, now replaced by sunlight. The wind picked up, and with it came the scent of morning bread and dust from the street. It was a new day, but not a clean one. She would wait, just for now, but only for the next signal. Time passed differently when one waited for word that could not come too early and must not come too late. She moved through the villa with the calm of someone tending to her usual duties, yet behind her eyes the clock ran differently, ticking not in minutes, but in questions. The staff went about their work, polite as ever, but she could feel their energy brushing against her own, like leaves brushing a still pond. They said nothing, asked nothing. Yet silence sometimes spoke louder than words. It wasn't suspicion that she feared most, it was pity. The kind that came when people saw more than they were meant to and stayed quiet because they no longer believed you would be spared. Midday brought the sound of carts rolling over the road just beyond the outer wall, their wooden wheels thudding against the stone with a rhythm that never quite settled. She stood in the shaded corridor watching their shapes pass between columns, merchants bringing goods to the next street over, soldiers returning from drill, perhaps even messengers with sealed tablets tucked under their arms. Each figure that passed might have been the one, but none of them slowed. The quiet stretched, and with it came the cold realization that she had no control over what was unfolding now. Her choices had already been made. Now she lived in the space between those choices and their consequences. She withdrew to the solarium, a room she rarely used, but one that offered long strips of sun across the tiled floor. The warmth there was gentle, and for a time she sat on the cushioned bench, letting the light creep slowly up her arms. There was a calmness in the room that did not belong to fear. Perhaps it was the silence of a place too rarely entered, or perhaps it was the way the windows softened the sounds from outside, making the world feel more distant than it truly was. In that quiet, she allowed herself a single thought of him, not the man seated at a table full of threats, but the man who once sat beside her in the garden, talking not of secrets, but of poetry. He had quoted something that day, lines from a play neither of them had seen performed in years, words about fate being neither friend nor enemy, but merely a mirror. She remembered how his voice had carried the line softly, almost lazily, as if the weight of it didn't need to be announced to be felt. The memory held her for a while. She almost smiled. But the moment was broken when a shadow passed across the doorway. She looked up, her body tensing before she could stop it, but it was only the steward, his head bowed slightly as he paused just outside. "Domina," he said gently. "A visitor waits at the servants' gate. He says he carries word from your uncle in Baiai the name was a code." She had no uncle in Baiai. It was a name they had agreed upon long ago to signal urgency, to let her know that whatever came next would not wait for nightfall. She rose quickly, thanking the steward with a calmness she didn't feel, and stepped out into the corridor again. Her feet moved without hesitation, yet every step carried more weight than the last. Down the hall, through the arch, past the storeroom, where the air always smelled faintly of olives and clay, and out to the narrow passage where deliveries were received. The man stood alone. Not a courier, not one of their usual messengers. Younger, rougher, his tunic dusted with road dirt, his face sun-darkened and lined from worry more than age. When he saw her, he nodded once and held out a folded parchment, sealed with plain wax, no insignia. She took it with steady hands, though her heart had begun its silent beating against her ribs. The man said nothing, only stepped back, then turned and disappeared into the street, lost to the crowd before she had even opened the message. She looked down at the seal, then slowly broke it with her thumb. She unfolded the parchment slowly, her fingers careful not to tear the corners as she worked the wax free and smoothed out the creases. The writing was sparse, only a few lines written in the same familiar hand she had memorized long ago. The ink was fresh, but the words felt ancient in weight, as if they had waited centuries for the right moment to arrive. Names spoken. One withdrew, one advanced. Keep to shadow. The flower will fall tomorrow. That was all. No signature, no date, no instructions, just the message, just enough. She read it twice, then a third time, each time drawing out something new. The phrase, "one withdrew," could only mean a member of the meeting had chosen caution. That was a small mercy. But one advanced. That was different. That meant someone had used the moment to push forward, to name names, to call debts, or perhaps to steer the conversation toward consequences. It meant the air in that room had grown thinner, and he had been there to breathe it. Keep to shadow. That was not advice. That was a plea. And then that final line, "The flower will fall tomorrow." It was poetic, yes, but not vague. She knew its meaning instantly. The flower referred to her. It always had. It was his way of marking her presence in his messages without drawing suspicion, cloaked in metaphor, but pointed in purpose. Tomorrow meant the moment was approaching when names would be spoken more clearly, perhaps publicly. If she remained exposed, she would be among them. If she stayed silent, her absence might speak just as loudly. The edge of danger was now close enough that she could feel it in the very breath of the villa's walls. She folded the parchment again, this time smaller, tighter, until it fit into the seam of her belt. Her mind raced quietly, behind her expression, already preparing. There was no panic. Panic would be useless now. This was the hour for quiet clarity, for slow hands and faster thoughts. She turned back through the stone corridor and made her way to her chambers, not running, not hurrying, but with a pace that did not falter. When she reached the doorway, she drew the curtain closed behind her and leaned against it for a moment, letting the heaviness of the message settle in her chest like cooled wax. Her eyes moved quickly to the satchel she had prepared days ago. She reached for it now, not to hold, but to examine, to make certain that everything was as it should be. The coin was still tucked beneath the garments, its worn face still catching the flicker of lamplight from the corner. The letter was still sealed. The other papers, names of those who owed her small favors, directions to a family estate far beyond the Tiber, all were in place. She had prepared for this moment, but preparation did not make the arrival easier. It only made it survivable. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the soft rustle of the linen beneath her the only sound in the room. The window was open just enough to let in the evening air, and from beyond it the city murmured, not in alarm, not in frenzy, just in its usual humming voice of footfalls and laughter and dogs barking at nothing. Rome was still being Rome. But inside this villa something very different was beginning. She had until tomorrow, not longer. That much was clear now. She would need to disappear without vanishing, to retreat without leaving a void, to fold herself inward into the quiet corners of the city that swallowed women like her, without question. And before nightfall, she would decide how. The decision did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, shaped not by impulse but by the quiet repetition of thought as the hours thinned toward evening. She stood again at the window, the wind touching her cheeks like a whisper too gentle to catch fully. Below, the olive tree moved as it always had, its long limbs sighing in the twilight. There was no sign in the branches, no sudden omen etched in the clouds. The world outside remained perfectly unchanged. But that was the very cruelty of Rome. It never tilted for personal grief or private danger. It let you walk its streets with ruin in your lungs and joy on your face. And it asked no questions either way. She stepped away from the window, her hands brushing the folds of her gown as she moved. The room felt smaller now, though nothing had changed. The walls held the same faint scent of wax and lavender. The cushions remained undisturbed. The mirror still hung, slightly crooked on the far wall, as it had for months. Yet she could feel something pulling inward, a closing in. The air itself seemed to curve gently toward the core of her chest, where that small message from earlier still pulsed like a second heartbeat. She sat again, this time at the writing table. Her fingers hovered for a long moment over the wooden box of ink sticks and quills. She had written countless things at this table, notes to tradesmen, careful instructions to the kitchen, letters to distant cousins thanking them for honeyed dates or fine cloth. But this would be different. She pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her, one already trimmed and softened at the edges. No seal, no title, just space. She took a breath, dipped the pen, and began. The words came slowly. She did not name names, she did not recount every detail. That would have been dangerous, even foolish. But she painted the shape of things, a quiet sketch of truth tucked between lines of simplicity. A letter that might look like a farewell to some and a signal to others. A message that could mean many things depending on who read it, but for one person only, it would mean everything. She signed it, not with her full name, but with the small symbol she had once drawn in the dust between his fingers beneath the bench in the garden. He would remember. He always remembered the quiet things. When she finished, she let the ink dry in the open air. She did not fold the letter just yet. There was one more thing to do. She rose, moved to the carved wooden chest at the base of her sleeping couch, and opened it slowly. Beneath layers of cloth and old sandals, she found what she was looking for. A small bronze brooch in the shape of a crescent moon. It was not valuable. It had belonged to her mother, worn only in the privacy of home. but it was the one item she had never worn since her mother's passing. Not because she feared breaking it, but because it always felt like a promise that needed keeping. Now she understood what that promise had been. She held the brooch in her palm for a moment, then placed it gently in the center of the folded satchel. It was time. She folded the letter, slipped it inside, and pulled the ties shut around the cloth. The satchel was no heavier than before, but it felt different in her hands now. More final. Outside, the sun was slipping fully beyond the rooftops. Shadows lengthened across the courtyard, and with them, her time grew short. She did not move at once. The satchel sat quietly on the edge of the table, its ties neatly knotted, the letter and brooch tucked safely inside. She watched the bundle as though it might somehow move on its own, carry itself away, make the choice for her. But it didn't. It remained still, waiting. Just as she had waited in that long stretch of time between warnings and consequences, between knowing what must be done and stepping fully into it. Outside, the courtyard had darkened almost completely. The last ribbons of light clung to the upper branches of the olive tree, stretching thin as silk before vanishing entirely. She reached for the satchel with both hands and held it against her chest. For a moment, she simply stood like that, motionless, the weight of the decision anchoring her to the floor. There was no audience here, no witness to this moment except the shadows gathered in the corners of the room. And still it felt ceremonial, like a private rite. One last breath of what had been before she stepped forward into what could no longer be undone. The corridors were quieter now, softened by the hush of early evening when most of the household slipped into meal or rest. Lamps had been lit at the junctions, their glow reflected in the polished stone beneath her feet. She moved with practiced ease, her steps light, her path casual enough to pass unnoticed. It was not the first time she had left the villa after sunset, and that familiarity offered protection. Her destination tonight was not far, a place she could reach within the hour if she walked with intention, though not haste. Haste was dangerous. It made people watch. And tonight, she needed to be no one's story. At the rear gate, the older servant, Gaius, looked up at her approach. His face, weathered by time and sun, showed neither surprise nor suspicion. He had been at the villa longer than most, loyal more by habit than affection. She met his eyes, and for one fleeting moment, she wondered whether he knew, not the details perhaps, but something. There had always been a kindness in his silences, a discretion born from seeing too much and saying too little. He nodded, not as a question, but as a quiet farewell, then turned back to his stool and resumed his quiet watch. The street beyond the gate was less traveled at this hour. Just a few passers-by, their heads down, their conversations soft and folded into the night. She kept to the edges, her cloak pulled forward, the satchel hidden beneath its folds. The sounds of the city shifted as she walked, from the echo of footsteps in narrow lanes to the low hum of voices near public fountains, then back again to the quiet of nearly deserted side streets. Rome, like a sleeping animal, murmured in its dreams as she passed. Her mind remained clear. She did not rehearse explanations or regrets. Those belonged to an earlier version of herself, one who had believed that being careful would always be enough. This version moved differently, not with fear, but with readiness. And as she turned into the alley that led to the garden courtyard, a place she had once entered only in stolen hours and with hesitant steps, she felt the air shift once more. Not ominous, just expectant. The gate was ajar, not wide, just slightly, enough to signal, enough to welcome. she stepped inside and let the night close gently behind her. The gate clicked softly behind her as it settled into place, the sound barely audible beneath the chorus of evening insects rustling through the low branches. She stood still for a moment in the dim light, letting her eyes adjust to the soft golden hue cast by a single oil lamp hanging from a post near the far wall. The courtyard felt smaller than she remembered, not because it had changed, but because everything in her had shifted. What once seemed like a place of gentle escape now felt like a chamber of decision. The stone beneath her sandals, the shadows curling at the corners, even the old vine climbing the wall. All of it seemed to press in, not with menace, but with awareness. This place knew what was coming. She moved toward the bench slowly, her fingers brushing the leaves of a rosemary bush as she passed. The scent rose immediately, familiar and grounding. He was already there, as she had hoped, seated in the curve of the wall where the moonlight pooled the deepest. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were watchful. He had always carried tension like that, folded beneath calm, hidden beneath a voice so steady it could convince others the sea was still, even in a storm. But tonight she saw through it. She always could. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence was not awkward. It had shape and meaning, like the breath before a vow. She set the satchel beside her on the bench and looked over at him, her hands still resting on her lap. For a moment his gaze dropped to the bundle and lingered there before returning to her face. "Safsudis," he said at last, the word barely a sound. "It's time." She nodded, the movement slow and deliberate. "Tomorrow?" she replied. "Or tonight, if we wait too long." He looked down, his hands folded now in thought. The garden smelled of crushed thyme and faint traces of ash. The lamp flickered once, a breeze lifted a strand of her hair across her cheek. And in that quiet fold of the city, wrapped between secrets and stone, they waited for the hour to tip forward, neither rushing it, neither fearing it, only ready. He reached forward and gently turned the satchel, as if needing to confirm it was truly there, that she had truly come with it. His fingers brushed the ties but didn't untie them. He didn't need to. He knew what was inside. The silence between them stretched a little longer, but it was not heavy. It was the kind of silence that lives between people who understand the shape of each other's thoughts. She watched him without looking away, her face composed but not guarded. The lamplight gave a softness to the sharp lines of his jaw, casting a flicker in his eyes that reminded her of the first time she had seen him speak in public. Even then, beneath the calm, she'd known he was never really still. "I thought about sending someone else," he said finally, his voice quiet and low. "Someone to meet you at the edge of the street, to take the bag and offer some clever excuse. But I knew you would come yourself." His gaze lifted to hers again, and this time there was a warmth behind the tiredness. "You never let others carry the hard things." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No one else would carry them, right?" she replied. "Not the way I needed them carried." He nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he already knew. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. The breeze had picked up, cooler now, sweeping gently through the narrow space of the courtyard. Somewhere beyond the garden, a gate creaked in the wind, the sound barely more than a breath. And still they sat, not because they didn't know what to do next, but because once they moved, the next page would begin, and they would no longer be the same people they were in this pause. He reached out then, his hand closing around hers without a word. It was not a desperate grasp, but something steadier, quieter, the kind of touch meant to remind rather than convince. Her fingers tightened briefly in response, and for the first time in days, her chest eased just slightly. They would move soon, but not quite yet. She let her hand rest in his a while longer, neither of them rushing to speak. There was nothing more to plan, nothing new to be said that hadn't already been whispered between them in evenings past, through glances across crowded rooms or murmured phrases passed between servants and shadows. What they had now was time measured not in hours, but in presence. And it was that presence, the shared stillness between two people who knew how close they stood to an ending, that felt heavier than any word could ever hold. He turned slightly toward her then, his thumb brushing her wrist, as he looked not just at her face, but through it, as if trying to hold the entire memory of her all at once. "After this," he said, the sentence trailing like smoke, "you can't come back. Not to this life, not to the villa, not to the markets where people know your name. Not even to the same side of the river. They'll watch everything." He wasn't warning her so much as laying it plain, placing the reality between them like a coin on a table. And she, without hesitation, nodded once. "I know," she said. "I never intended to." That honesty sat between them with no need for softening. She had known from the moment the parchment arrived that this wasn't just a step sideways. It was a departure. The kind that doesn't allow for turning back, not because of guilt or regret, but because the path itself collapses behind you once crossed. And yet, knowing all this, she felt no fear now, only clarity. It was a strange thing how fear drained out of a person once they truly accepted that something was already set in motion. What replaced it was quieter. Not peace, exactly, but readiness. A breeze moved through the courtyard again, stirring the edges of her cloak, lifting strands of hair against her cheek. He looked at her for a moment longer, then released her hand, slowly, deliberately. She felt the absence of his touch, as if a light had been dimmed, but she didn't reach for it again. Instead, she rose to her feet, lifting the satchel once more, and letting it rest at her side. She turned toward the far archway where the garden path gave way to a narrower alley. Beyond it, the city waited. And so did what came next. She didn't look back as she passed beneath the stone arch, though the quiet behind her seemed to pull at her like the last tug of sleep before waking. Her footsteps made no echo, softened by the worn dirt and scattered petals that lay across the garden path. The satchel shifted against her hip, its gentle weight a reminder that she was not empty-handed, that she carried both a past she was leaving and a plan she had chosen. The alley that opened before her was narrow, hemmed in by walls of sun-bleached stone and ivy curling thick along the upper ledges. A cat darted across ahead, its tail flicking as it vanished into a gap between the buildings. The world was still breathing, still alive, and in some ways that made everything sharper. As she moved deeper into the city's quieter edges, the houses pressed closer together, their windows mostly shuttered now. The warmth of earlier light had given way to a cooler stillness, one where torches burned low and voices carried softly but didn't linger. A few figures passed her without a glance, cloaked and hurried, each caught up in their own errands. No one saw her, not really, and that for once felt like a gift. She had become part of the backdrop, a moving piece in Rome's great turning, no more suspicious than the breeze. At the edge of the old district, she turned toward a narrow gate half hidden behind a fig stall, one she had passed a dozen times without entering. It opened with a creak, just enough for her to slip through, and then she was inside the courtyard of an inn too modest for senators, but too clean for scandal. A small fountain burbled at the center, the water soft against the night. The woman at the door recognized her not by name, but by the signal she had been told to watch for. The way the satchel was carried, the ribbon threaded through its ties. No words were exchanged, just a nod, and then she was shown to a room tucked behind a stone stairwell, quiet and unseen. Inside, she sat on the edge of the cot and placed the satchel on the floor. Her breath came steady now, measured and calm. She had arrived where she needed to be. For tonight, that was enough. The room was small, but it had a kind of peace she hadn't known she needed. The walls were made of simple stone, cool to the touch and bare of decoration, but they carried a silence that felt protective. A single clay lamp sat on the wooden table, its flames steady, casting soft shadows that danced lazily along the ceiling. She slipped off her cloak and folded it over the stool, the fabric falling with a sigh. For the first time in many days, she allowed her shoulders to lower, to soften from the tension that had lived there too long. She moved to the window, a narrow slit set high in the wall, and leaned against its frame. From here she could see nothing of the grand parts of Rome, no forum or temple roof, just the slope of the neighboring rooftop and the thin curl of smoke rising into the night. Yet it was enough. That simple sight anchored her. Somewhere out there, beyond the modest lanes and the cracked tiles and whispering alleys, decisions were being made, conversations were turning sharp. Names might already be leaving mouths and reaching ears not meant to hear them. But in this little room, the city's weight paused. Time moved more slowly here, like the drifting of ash in still air. She sat down again and reached for the satchel, untied it gently, and pulled out the brooch. The bronze moon still caught the light in its own quiet way. She turned it over in her hand, tracing the small nicks and worn edges left from her mother's hands years ago. It was not magic, not protection in the literal sense. But it was something older, something steadier, a reminder of strength that did not need to announce itself to exist. She set it beside her on the cot and let her hand rest near it. Outside, the sound of footsteps passed the courtyard gate, slow and even, likely a night vendor, or someone returning late from the taverns. It was Rome being Rome again, unchanged by the invisible thread she was now part of. But she had stepped out of one world and into another. Tomorrow the winds might shift, but tonight, here in the hush of stone and firelight, she could breathe. She lay back on the cot without undressing, the rough wool of the blanket pulled over her only loosely. The lamp burned low beside her, its flame flickering now and then, but never quite going out. The ceiling above was uneven, bearing the soft cracks and lines of 100 years, yet watching them felt like reading a map, as if the day's meaning could be traced there in quiet code. Sleep hovered just out of reach, not because of fear, but because her mind moved gently through the folds of memory, sifting through pieces she hadn't touched in years. Faces drifted through her thoughts, not only his, but others, people she had trusted once, some who had betrayed her in small ways, others who had stayed silent when silence had mattered most. Rome had taught her long ago that loyalty was not the same as love, and that knowing the difference was its own kind of armor. Her fingers reached again for the brooch, turning it over slowly between her palms. She thought of her mother as a younger woman, her voice always calm even when firm, her laughter rare but genuine. She had worn this brooch only in the evenings, never to temples or festivals. It was private, intimate. She used to tell her that the moon kept secrets better than the sun ever could, that a woman must learn to live in moonlight if she wished to move freely through the world. At the time, she hadn't understood. She had thought her mother was speaking in riddles. But now, lying alone in a borrowed room with the weight of hidden choices beneath her ribs, she understood perfectly. A sound outside stirred her from thought, faint but distinct, the hush of a door closing softly, careful footsteps against stone. Her body went still, listening. It wasn't fear that held her there, but instinct. Then came the quiet knock, not at her door, but further down the hall. 2 slow taps, a pause, then one more. She knew that rhythm, a courier's signal, and not just any, his. She stood slowly, brushing down her gown and slipping the brooch back into the satchel, its presence now joined with the readiness in her chest. The night had shifted. Something had been set in motion. She moved toward the door, quiet as a breath, and pressed her ear gently to the wood. The footsteps had stopped now. A moment passed, then another, before she opened the door just enough to peer into the dim corridor. A young boy stood at the end, no older than 10, his tunic slightly too large and stained at the hem. He held no torch, only a small scroll pressed close to his chest. When he saw her, he didn't speak. He simply walked forward and placed the scroll into her hand with a kind of practiced precision that told her he had done this before. She nodded once, and the boy turned and disappeared into the dark, slipping through the shadows like a thread pulled through cloth. Back inside, she unrolled the scroll quickly, but with care. The writing was sharp and spare. The shield is broken. The red house listens. Leave before first call. Her eyes lingered on the phrase. The shield, likely, one of the men who had been guarding the meeting, had been compromised. The red house was a name only they used, a villa tied to someone with influence and little mercy. And first call meant dawn. That gave her hours, not many, but enough. She breathed in deeply and sat on the edge of the cot once more, her hand tightening slightly around the satchel. There was no more room for hesitation. Every door that could have offered protection had now quietly closed. She would have to move before the city stirred, before faces turned curious and gates began to open. In that moment, her stillness was not defeat. It was focus. She knew what came next. She dressed quickly, securing her cloak with a careful hand, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this many times in her mind, even if never quite like this in truth. The satchel was slung over her shoulder, resting snug against her side, its weight now strangely reassuring. Before she left, she paused at the door once more, letting her eyes travel around the small room, taking in the quiet lamp still flickering, the lines of her footprints soft in the dust, the thin curve of the brooch now tucked inside. It had been a temporary refuge, no more than a handful of hours, but in its stillness it had given her something she hadn't expected. A final breath before movement. A moment to name what she was about to leave behind. Outside, the corridor was still empty. She moved through it silently, the soft soles of her shoes brushing over the stone without sound. The innkeeper did not appear. No doors opened. It was as though the entire building held its breath with her, offering her its silence as a parting gift. She stepped into the courtyard, the fountain whispering beside her, and made her way toward the narrow passage leading to the back. It was the route she'd been told to take if things became unsafe. A single door, half sunken into the foundation wall, led to a stairwell so tight it felt carved from the rock itself. At the bottom of those steps waited the path she hoped would remain unguarded. She did not run, she did not flinch. She only moved, one step at a time, steady and sure, the night folding behind her like a curtain drawn gently shut. The passage opened into a quiet stretch of road, flanked by garden walls and storage sheds, the kind of place that lived unnoticed in the folds of the city. The sky above had just begun to shift, stars softening behind a pale veil of morning light that had not yet touched the ground. She walked close to the edge, her steps steady, her eyes alert but calm. A cart passed slowly at the far end of the street, its driver nodding off between jolts of the wheels, unaware of anything but the road ahead. There was still time, not much, but enough. She turned onto the path that wound gently past the old granary, the stones beneath her feet damp with dew. Her breath rose faintly in the cool air, each exhale a quiet offering to the silence that surrounded her. The satchel pressed close to her side, the brooch within catching none of the light, but holding all of her memory. The city behind her had not yet woken, but she no longer belonged to it. Ahead, beyond the final turn, waited the boat. She could already smell the faint salt of the river. The next breath would carry her to it. The boat waited near the base of a crumbling stone embankment, half cloaked in shadow, its figure barely more than a silhouette against the slow shimmer of the river. A man stood beside it, arms folded, face hidden beneath the hood of his cloak. She didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it. That was how this had always been arranged. He held out a hand, helping her down the last few steps where the morning mist hung thick, wrapping the riverbank in a soft hush. Her shoes met the planks of the boat and didn't slip. The satchel rested at her side now, but she no longer felt its weight. The city behind her had receded into a quiet blur, its rooftops barely touched by the grey of approaching dawn. The man pushed the boat gently away from shore, his pole stirring the glassy water. It didn't creak or shudder, just floated into the current as if it belonged there, as if they both did. She sat with her back to the city, her eyes fixed on the dark bend ahead, and let herself exhale, not in fear, not in regret, but with the kind of release that comes only after a decision has been kept. The river moved slowly, its surface smooth as silk, broken only by the quiet rhythm of the oar, dipping in and out of the water. She sat still, her eyes unfocused, watching the faint outline of trees pass along the bank, their reflections drifting beside her. There were no more plans now, no more coded messages or secret glances, just the soft pull of water and the widening sky above. As the boat rounded the bend and the city vanished fully from view, she let her head rest against the worn wood behind her and closed her eyes. She was free.